Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Manetti Shrem Museum. My name is Madeline and I'm a visitor services student, a staffer. And before we begin today's program, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which UC Davis sits. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Katchildihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Tletsaldihi Wintun Nation, and the Yachadihi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people are committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. And now, Rachel Teagle, the founding director of the Manetti Shrem Museum. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the museum. It's such an honor always to be host to the Templeton Colloquium. Welcome, Alan. And even though we had a fantastic colloquium online last year, it's so great to be together in person. Thank you for being here. Welcome back. So it is a particular pleasure to welcome you to this year's colloquium of Satire and Bigotry, Press Culture, Women's Rights, and Liminal Modernity in West Asia. The museum is really proud of the collaborative relationship that we've developed over the years with our art historian colleagues here on campus, and we're really honored to be the home of this special annual event. Every year, the Templeton Colloquium brings to light the most pressing questions and issues in the field of art history, much like last year's topic that focused on race and museums. This year's topic is no less timely, as it is an especially crucial moment to examine the complexities of minority women in Muslim-majority nations, spaces where strategies towards modernization have relied upon the visual representation of women. And we at UC Davis are fortunate to have in our midst one of the great scholars and thinkers on this topic, Professor Taline Grigor, in addition to all of today's esteemed lecturers who have gathered this afternoon. Like all of you, I am eager to learn from our speakers and so happy to be here together with you. And with that, Taline, take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to the 9th Annual Templeton Colloquium in Art History, supported very generously by Alan Templeton, who has been a resolute patron of our program and its growth over a decade. We are deeply grateful to him, as well as to our invaluable partners in making this event happen. For our 4 speakers who so generously agreed to come in person and sort of relaunch our in-person colloquiums, to Dean Atekwana and her staff, Crystal, for helping us actually globalize the event by live streaming, to the Shrem museum team, the incredible team that has always housed this event so generously, to the Art Studio program and the faculty who are present, to the art history faculty and staff, and to our loyal audience who has always sort of been here with us over the years, and of course to all of our students. My warm-hearted thanks go especially to Lisa Zeitbell, who is our remarkable Templeton staff, who has seen to all the big and small details of this event. She even left chocolate on their pillows. It is especially an honor for me to welcome and introduce our new dean to her first Templeton Colloquium. Dean Estela Atekwana began her tenure as Dean of the College of Letters and Science this last August. She previously served as Dean at the University of Delaware's College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment, and as head of the Boone Pickens School of Geology of Oklahoma State University. She serves as the governing board of Botswana International University of Science and Technology. A renowned scholar and geoscientist. I have practiced these words a lot. Her research interest includes biogeophysics, near-surface geophysics, tectonics, geodynamics, and continental rifting. She has a collaborative National Science Foundation project in Uganda to study the Albertine Rift and has received over $11 million in research funding, primarily from the US Department of Energy, the NSF, and industry. She is a fellow of the Geological Society of America and a recipient of Outstanding Educators Awards from the Association of Women's Geoscientists and the Society of Exploration Geophysicists, SEG. Her contributions to exploration geophysics were recognized with the 2021 Reginald Fessenden Award from SEG, as well as the SEG 2020 Virtual Near Surface Global Lecturer Award. Welcome, Dean Atekwana.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everyone. It is so good to see everybody in person. You know, I'm looking like, I see that face. I think I recognize it from Zoom, little postage stamp, Zoom pictures. So it's wonderful to be here in person. I am really pleased to welcome you all to the Allen Templeton Colloquium in Art History, which is presented this year by our college's Department of Art and Art History. For those of you who, as you've already heard, that I'm new to the college, and it is really wonderful to be here in the Jan Shrem and Maria Manetti Shrem Museum of Art, who are great partners and friends of our college. Connecting with our community through events like this is one of the greatest joys in my role as Dean. And I really want to thank you all for joining us. And I keep saying I am more of a mathematical and physical science person. It's been such a delight to learn so much about our arts, the humanities, the social sciences. It's really opening a wonderful new world to me, and I really appreciate it and want to really acknowledge our faculty for all the amazing work that they do in enhancing, the success of our students. So today I'm really excited to delve into today's topics, which have a personal connection. For me, as some of you may know, if you've read a little bit about my story, I'm a geophysicist. And for me, pursuing geophysics as a career was actually a rebellion against my parents and the cultural norms of family expectations. So I'm looking forward to learning more about the cultural shifts in women's rights and minority rights our speakers will discuss today. Their talks will examine the question, how were women's rights and minority rights resisted and appropriated in satirical media in West Asia during the earlier 20th century. Conversations like this one create a rich environment for learning and discourse at UC Davis. I'm grateful to our guests, all of you who've taken time off from your very busy schedules to come and be here with us. So we have here Yasemin Gencer, I hope I pronounced that right, affiliate scholar at Indiana University. I do have a connection to Indiana, by the way. Institute for Advanced Study, and Houri Berberian, professor of art history at UC Irvine. Camron Michael Amin, professor of history at the University of Michigan. I do have a Michigan connection as well, in Dearborn. And Nadia von Maltzahn, research associate at the Orient Institute Beirut. No connection there. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sure that our students and our faculty do appreciate your presence here. So before I turn it back to Professor Grigor, I would like to thank a very, very dear friend of UC Davis for making today possible. Alumnus and longtime supporter and friend of our college, Allen Templeton, who is here with us today. Thank you, Alan. Since you graduated from UC Davis, since you graduated from UC Davis in 1982, you've made extraordinary contributions across the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Your multiple endowments within the college include your endowed chair in art and art history held by Professor Michael Amin, who also joins us today. Is Michael here? Thank you. Good to meet you. Yes, and thank you for providing the critical support that makes this event possible. You know, when I first met Alan, he told me, he said, the arts and the humanities and the social sciences don't get enough support from the administration, so this is why I do this. It really touched my heart, and I'm really, really appreciative, and consider me a partner in making sure that our arts and humanities are resourced. So for the past 8 years, this lecture has enabled the College of Letters and Science to uphold our position as a liberal arts powerhouse by examining languages, literature, and art through an interdisciplinary perspective. Alan, your passion, curiosity, and involvement have substantially enriched the intellectual life of not only our college, but also the campus as a whole. So delighted to always see him come here to visit with the students and the faculty. It is really truly a delight. We have seen the positive impact your gifts have made on our students, faculty, and global scholarship. And we are thrilled to have you as part of our college community. Simply put, we could not do this without you. And for this, we are truly grateful. So thank you, Alan. And with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Professor Gregor to introduce our first speaker. And I really look forward to hearing all the very interesting things you're going to share with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, our first speaker is Dr. Yasemin Gencer, who is a historian of Islamic art focused on late Ottoman and early Republican visual culture and print media, with a special interest in text and image studies. She is the author of an online research blog entitled Today in 1920s Turkey, and a founding member of Khamsin, an Islamic art history online, a web-based platform devoted to the production and distribution of teaching resources for Islamic art history. She is affiliate scholar at Indiana University's Institute for Advanced Studies and teaches Islamic art and architecture at Wayne State University. Her talk is entitled Modernity, Image, and Liminal Identities in the Early Turkish Republican Press.
All right. Okay. Before I begin, I would just like to extend my gratitude to Talene for inviting me and organizing this colloquium, and to Lisa for all of your logistical help that has gotten us all here today. So thank you. And now to my paper. The Turkish popular press of the 1920s witnessed the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1922 and the establishment of a republic in its place in 1923. Roughly 10 years of war preceded these political events, which were followed by a series of social reforms aimed at transforming state and people. Where the effects of such legislative changes were not visible, the press intervened, often prematurely, with visual justification, proof, or assurance of the benefits, desirability, and popularity of the reformed matters. And in fact, a gradual rise in the ratio between image and text marks this period as a uniquely visual one, a clear response to the reform initiatives spearheaded by the nascent state. These reforms, with the help of the supportive national press, redefined and reinforced Turkish national identity based around modern and secular ideals. My own research on early Republican print culture began with political cartoons and the satirical press. This period of political flux and rapid succession reforms found visual expression in cartoons which captured a shifting national profile marked with modern appearances and lifestyles. Addressing an imagined Turkish audience, these reforms were communicated and re-envisioned with symbolically charged and overwhelmingly binary visual analogies. These political cartoons routinely cast the Turkish nation as male, white, healthy, strong, and dare I say, dapper. While such representations are ubiquitous, they also beg the question, what about the others? Where do non-dominant demographics, namely women and ethnic and religious minorities, lie in this vast landscape of image-based identity formation that was taking shape, repeated, and further disseminated in the popular press? Thus, my presentation explores the representation of minoritized populations within this period of change and how the Turkish press assigned various roles to them to underscore their otherness and reduce them to supporting actors, passive characters, or belligerent antagonists to the Turkish male. To this end, my paper focuses on the visual treatment of two specific groups, women and the Kurdish ethnic minority population, to demonstrate how both were used to reinforce the ideal modern Turkish male identity, and therefore his hegemony over public and political spaces. Naturally, as more or less half the population, depictions of women are ubiquitous in the press. And although their roles varied, they were rarely politically active and, more often than not, served an ornamental purpose. The female form can be encountered on the covers of magazines for the purpose of selling more copies, and in the pages of journals to illustrate stories, tantalize the reader, and surprise them with unconventional behaviors and talents. Their inclusion in political cartoons reveals the limited extent of their agency in the young republic. A common use of the female form within the political cartoon genre is as a personification of a more abstract or collective idea. For instance, this cartoon commemorates the anniversary of Istanbul's emancipation from Allied occupation. Here, the former Ottoman capital city is envisioned as a sultry flapper girl reclining at the heels of a heroic Turkish soldier. The allocation of active and passive roles along gender lines reiterates and fortifies these distinctions in national discourses. Thus, without any acknowledged agency in politics, her power over her own physical appearance emerges as a point of contention and pivot of anxiety. The clothing and unclothing of the female body was, in fact, a recurring subject in the popular press. This cheeky cartoon, which hardly requires explanation, portrays a woman helplessly watching as a young man cuts open her skirt on one end, while an older man sews her blouse up at the other. Entitled The Struggle, or Mücadele, the cartoon centers around the wishes of two differently aged men struggling to control the woman's appearance. The imagery shows the woman as ambivalent, and the caption below confirms this as she says, "One opens it, one closes it, even I am confused," implying that the woman ultimately lacks control over the exposure of her own body. This next cartoon offers a more sympathetic view of the woman's predicament in society. Here, two women endure very different existences. Caged and veiled, the scene on the right underscores the woman's dependence on a man and her lack of freedom and agency in her own life. The scene on the left portrays a half-nude woman on her hands and knees, sinking in a marshland as a voyeur looks on with detached amusement. Above the split frame floats the age-old question, can a middle ground not be found? The statement itself is frustratingly passive. Who is to find this middle ground? What economic, national, or biological interests are at stake? And is a woman's pursuit of happiness, in fact, a matter of first satisfying these external demands? The bounds of female agency and empowerment are, however, tested early on in the young state's existence. One of the major political changes that took place only 4 months after the declaration of the Republic was the abolition of the Caliphate in March 1924. This act was controversial, and opposition to it in the press was met with legal action from the state. Reforms in the areas of education and the management of religious affairs were also passed at this time. Such an abundance of change, especially the abolition of the centuries-old institution of the Caliphate, gave the impression that nothing was sacred or untouchable, and as such, other fundamental changes could also be possible. This cartoon, featured on the cover of the satirical gazette Zümrüt dismisses 2 issues raised in the weeks following the abolition of the Caliphate. Depicted as fruits labeled Latin letters and female representatives, these matters are held by a wide-eyed toddler identified in the title as the Young Republic. Furthermore, the following question is included below. Is it appropriate to give a child unripe fruit? Here, the Republic is playfully infantilized to justify denying action on a woman's right for political representation. This bad faith framing skews the public discourse on this issue at both ends, claiming the Republic to be too young to act and the issues too undeveloped to be considered. The bifurcation of state and nation was a convenient duality of the early Republic, allowing it to claim effectiveness or feign impotence when necessary. Whereas the Turkish nation is envisioned as eternal and celebrated for its very propensity for action, as demonstrated by the recent victories of the War of Independence, the new Republic and its inexperience or fragility becomes the concurrent reason for the very same nation, now imagined as a child, to lack the capacity to act. Likewise, framing women's suffrage and alphabet reform as unripe or raw only works within the vacuum of the Republic, conveniently severed from an Ottoman past in which, not too long ago, these issues were discussed. Thus, neither matter is new, and both have been fleshed out in public discourse since the turn of the century. Whereas Turkish women faced systematic denial of political agency and limitations of their rights, roles, and place in the new Republican order, religious and ethnic minorities suffered even greater restrictions to their lifestyles and identities as a result of nationalization, secularization, and modernization efforts. For instance, the educational reforms of March 1924 unified school curricula and abolished religious schools that were attached to mosques, in addition to now excluding mandatory religion classes. Such laws also applied to missionary and minority schools, which were now obligated to teach Turkish language classes and remove religious instruction from their curricula. Such changes, along with the exiling of the caliph, caused the press to turn their attention to the leaders of religious minority communities, emphasizing their precarious, if not liminal, status within the new modern state. To this end, nationalist principles of uniformity and secularization targeted all religious communities, creating a sense of uncertainty and unpredictability. However, the processes informing such decisions were far from fair, as the legislation that affected minority schools was written and decided upon by a largely homogeneous assembly of Muslim representatives, without consulting these other religious communities. That being said, minorities did not enjoy regular coverage in the Turkish press. Rather, the subject only reappears whenever new legislation was passed or a conflict or scandal arose in current events. For instance, negative portrayals of Greeks, especially Greek soldiers, circulated widely in the early 1920s during the War of Independence, which entailed violent battles between the Turkish nationalist forces and Greeks in Western Anatolia. Likewise, long after the war was over, cartoons would regularly appear during national holidays or related victory anniversaries, rendering Greek soldiers as violently vanquished enemies. Not surprisingly, in addition to political revolutions, violent conflicts such as war and rebellions create pivots of anxiety in which identities are most overtly challenged and misrepresented. In the earliest years of the Republic, when there were no international conflicts, one domestic uprising served as the catalyst for a host of responses from the administration and press alike. Almost exactly 1 year after the abolition of the Caliphate, in February and March of 1925, the Şeyhsait revolt erupted in the eastern provinces of Anatolia. Originating as a Kurdish demand for the reinstatement of the Caliphate and a general call to all of Turkey's Muslims to demand less secularization, the administration and military responded to this uprising with extraordinary force. Indeed, without the Caliphate as connective tissue, the ethnic Kurdish minority, as stateless fellow Muslims to the Turks, were presented with no alternative but assimilation into the dominant Turkish fold. The revolt sparked a rash of racially charged political cartoons in the press for the remainder of 1925, and the imagery, like all cartoons, is manipulated in ways that could not be accomplished so easily with photography. In the case of the Şeyhsait revolt and its representation in the press, a general trend towards abstraction is visible over the course of 1925. During the ongoing conflict, the Kurdish ethnicity of the belligerents took center stage, as did their desire for independence. As such, the cartoons of this event are visceral, straightforward, and blunt. This cartoon, published on the cover of Karagöz, a nationalist people's gazette, depicts the Kurdish rebels in oversized, baggy pants, fur vests, and massive turbans. The leader and two of his comrades are located outside a very squat, primitive hut bearing the incongruous label, the Kingdom of Kurdistan, while a personification of the British Empire, backed by the last Ottoman Sultan, approach with newly minted weapons. Meanwhile, in the background, a Turkish army bristling with bayonets closes in. The branding strategy of representing the Kurdish rebels as primitive continued in the immediate aftermath of the failed revolt. A cartoon published on the front page of the satirical journal Akbaba on 9 April 1925 is especially striking as it shows a hairy ape wearing the distinctive Kurdish headgear and a loincloth in 2 acts. On the right, he holds a saber and a bag of money. Here, the ape is not acting on his own free will, but is animated by another personification of Britain, who performs as a puppeteer from behind the screen. This frame is accompanied with the caption, "This is how it began." The scene on the left, bearing the caption, "This is how it ended," shows the same ape's lifeless body hanging from a noose held by a rather cheerful Turkish soldier. Besides the unmistakable headgear, there are no overt identifications of the ape as representing Kurds or a Kurdish independent movement, although the titles above the cartoons identify the scenes as the insurrection play, thusly connecting it to the Şeyhsait revolt. In this way, the collective identity of the Kurdish polity is glossed over and obscured, and furthermore, the agency of the Kurdish rebels is undermined and denied with the inclusion of the British puppet master. As such, the ape's motivations are reduced to financial gain, and his actions construed as externally inspired. In this way, the cartoonist denies agency and legitimacy to the Kurdish movement. And needless to say, the primitive ape caricature denies even basic humanity to the Kurdish rebels, Accordingly, they are represented as subhuman beasts. In the following month, as the revolt was quelled, the press's commentary on Kurds as their involuntary place in the national community entered a new reconstructive phase. The next cartoon presents its readers with a machine labeled School and Civilization, which is located somewhere between a dilapidated village on the right and bustling factory town on the left. At first glance, the machine seems to modernize those who pass through it, enlightening the docile men with education and civilizing them with the mere crank of a lever. Yet closer examination reveals that the men streaming in from the right are dressed in traditional Kurdish garb. In this way, through the change in costume from baggy shalwars, wide kamarbans, vests, and turbans, to fitted suits, fezzes, and clean-shaven faces, we witness the imagined assimilation of Kurds into an overtly modern and homogeneously Turkish sartorial norm, with a strong undercurrent of obedience directed squarely at civilized factory-line work. However, here, the people subjected to the transformation are unidentified. The text below the cartoon has the journal's mascot, Karagöz, on top of the machine, encouraging his accomplice, Hacivat, to crank it because, quote, as long as this machine runs, the nation will awaken and be saved from ignorance and disaster, unquote. The word millet, or nation, is used as a shorthand for the Turkish nation, but the original use of the term from the Ottoman period always implied a religious affiliation rather than an ethnic one. As such, the use of millet here flickers between implying its older meaning of Muslim nation and its newer meaning of the Turkish nation. Thus, this cartoon is striking in its explicit visualization of the civilizing process as one of assimilation and homogenization, and in its use of vague language that serves to obscure the distinct identity of the Kurdish people subjected to the Turkish nation-state project. In the months that followed the revolt, hundreds involved in the armed insurrection, including its leader, Sheikh Said, were tried in the state's infamous independence tribunals and subsequently executed, photographs and cartoons of which peppered the news cycle from May to August. Once the dust had settled, in the latter months of the year, the event was abstracted, obscured, and rebranded into a revolt of conservative reaction, or irtija, and represented or zoomorphized frequently as a venomous snake. In this way, all opposition and dissent towards any westernizing reforms were described as a reemergence or reanimation of conservative reaction, especially if it lent itself to the polemics of the separation of mosque and state. While the Turkish press regularly omitted coverage of minorities and their political concerns and actively obscured traces of Kurdish identity, women remained a very visible and indispensable part of the visual mediascapes of the early Turkish Republican press, even though the political concerns of women, like minorities, were often suppressed. But these two communities in particular, women and Kurds, experienced an acute rise in coverage specific to 1925. Around the same time the state was reacting to the Sheikh Said revolt, the newly minted Women's League of Turkey began campaigning for more public conversations about women's rights. In one instance, Nezihe Muhittin, the founder of the league, called for mosques to be used for delivering educational lectures to women about their empowerment, which the press mercilessly lampooned. Thus, the mainstream press's misrepresentation or dismissal of the actions of women and minorities pursuing political rights and equality demonstrates the fragile nature of the constructed and imagined Turkish male identity at the dawn of the Republic. At first glance, these cartoons seem jubilant and confident in their hegemony, power, and place of the Turkish nation or nascent republic. Yet closer examination reveals that these assertions of dominance and control are themselves reactions to counter-hegemonic challenges to these very claims. In this way, these cartoons, with their assertive facades, cleverly conceal a greater existential anxiety during the early republic, which is better described as a period of tremendous uncertainty for the new state and its various peoples. This cartoon, for instance, celebrates the 2-year anniversary of the establishment of the republic in rather violent terms. Here, the Turkish nation is envisioned as a distinctly co-ed group of people united against a large serpent bearing the label irtija, or conservative reaction. The snake's body runs through a crown labeled the sultanate, and thus refers overtly to the most recent threat to the state's existence, the Sheikh Said revolt. Uniquely here, we witness the symbolic participation of women alongside, or rather behind, her male brethren. Thus here, finally, a female character is afforded agency, but only as an ally to, or enforcer of, Turkish national interests. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Yasemin. Our next speaker is Professor Houri Berberian, who is a professor of history, the Meghrouni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies, and the director of the Center for Armenian Studies at UC Irvine. Her books include Armenians and the Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1905-1911, The Love for Freedom Has No Fatherland in 2001, and the multi-award-winning Roving Revolutionaries, Armenians and the Connected Revolutions in the Russian, Iranian, and Ottoman Worlds in 2019. Her talk today, entitled Pictorial Modernity, Satirical Newspapers, and the Armenian Women of Iran, 1920 to 58, is a part of her next book, co-authored book, entitled Picturing the Silences, Minoritarian Modernism, and the Armenian Women in Iran, under contract with Stanford University Press. And of course, I am honored to be the co-author, and I've already learned so much from her.
The honor is mine. And it's also an honor to be part of the Templeton Colloquium. Thank you. The paper today is also part of an article that will be appearing in Iranian Studies in March. But you guys are fortunate because you'll be seeing many more images than will appear in the article. So, I shall begin. So although we have some evidence of the stirrings of Armenian women around the women's question during the Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1905, it was not until 1939 that an Irano-Armenian feminist-leaning organization was established, and woman-centered activity took shape in the immediate aftermath of Reza Shah's exile in 1941, when many organizations were launched and became active players in shaping Iran's second phase of modernization, especially through the declaration of the 1963 White Revolution by Mohammad Reza Shah. This era of nagging modernity, witnessed a public contestation between conservative forces like the Armenian Apostolic Church and Armenian political parties, and the embryonic and independent women's movement. During this period, in the absence of Armenian language women's journals in Iran, satirical journals such as Bobokh, Boogeyman, and Sahavel, Birch Broom, took the lead in attempting to shape the community's views on women. Through their biweekly and monthly masculinist antagonism toward women and critique of Armenian women's lifestyle, male editors attempted to control the narrative about the proper modernization of women, often through, quote, hyperbolic, oversimplified, and repetitive, end quote, representation, similar to European satirical journals like Punch. Bobokh was Iran's first Armenian language biweekly satirical periodical. On page after page, women appear in both rich text and black and white graphics as impressions of a changing society. Satire appeared in the pages of Bobokh by caricaturists such as Dervish, the pseudonym of Andrei Sevrugen, the son of Antoine Sevrugen, and an artist in his own right. And after his departure, Margar Garapegyan, who went by the pen name Dev, which means devil or demon, described by those who remember him as Khoshtip, good-looking, and a Don Juan. Dev produced caricatures of Armenian women for Bobokh and later Tsahavel that mirrored his public persona. Bobokh targeted two arenas with great zeal. First, the Irano-Armenian community and the intracommunal affairs, and second, women. Whatever form it took, whether doled out lightly or in outright mockery and ridicule, the criticism unreservedly reflected and reinforced readers' and society's sexism, its gendered fears and anxieties, and what it perceived to be the perils of modernity, which the satirical paper viewed as threatening to the Irano-Armenian community's traditional and patriarchal gender relations and culture. Bobokh's anxieties regarding modernity manifested in biting criticism that targeted women's fashion and lifestyle choices, such as shortened skirts and hair, décolleté tops, makeup, and modern dance, all clearly informed by or modeled upon practices in Europe and the US. Bobokh's projections for the future of women's fashion seemed especially grim if its readers were to judge by its line drawing of 6 women spanning the years 1875 to 1940 under the heading Fashion's Past, Present, and Future. Typical of its exaggerated manner parodying women's vogue, the paper predicted that given the increasingly minimalist trend, women would barely be clothed by 1940. The caption reads, quote, "Very little aptitude is required to foretell the fashion of 1950." End quote. A popular graphic trope of Western caricature, the stripping modern woman also made appearances in Persian language journals, such as Tehran's Tawfiq, but much later in 1960, and of course in color. Although the satirical paper also leveled some of its criticism at men's hypocrisy or fashion, its anxieties revolved largely around the impact of modernity on women, precisely because they were perceived as preservers and carriers of culture and tradition. Modernity was seen to simultaneously effeminize men and masculinize women, thus perhaps lessening gender differences and equalizing men and women. To Bobokh and its readers, the danger lay not only in fashion, but also in what must have seemed even more menacing, sexuality. The trope of the scheming, conniving, untrustworthy woman was not new to the 1920s or 1930s. However, the anxiety of equalizing sexuality or sexual behavior brought on by modernity, so well represented in the illustration titled Contemporary Understandings, certainly was. Note that the illustration shows 2 panes. On the left is a woman seated watching a man place a naked woman's upright body on a bookcase next to other similar women's bodies, much like one would with a book. On the right is a man seated watching a woman carrying out exactly the same action, but in her case, placing a naked man's upright body among a sea of other similar bodies. All the women in the illustration have short hair, yet the 2 who are dressed are modestly so, and almost all of the men lack facial hair. Perhaps all these are markers of the modern man and the modern woman. The caption encapsulates the message, quote, "Just as for certain men, women, for certain women, men, resemble books. After reading them, they arrange them in the library, end quote. For most of its existence, the paper oscillated between parody and derision in its representation and imagining of women. In only 2 cases do we come across substantially different portrayal, one that seeks to evoke empathy or engagement rather than ridicule. Both illustrations appear in 1925, almost in consecutive issues. One is a goddess-like woman with long hair and eyelashes in what resembles a toga labeled with the words Armenian public, Hay Hasaraguchun, lying unconscious with arms outstretched as 2 seemingly large fierce bulls representing different political currents in Tehran's Armenian community menacingly loom over her, ready to kill for the sake of inter-party solidarity. Although on closer inspection, it seems the bulls may be grinning. The other is a black and white reprint of a color original by caricaturist Alexander Sarukhan that appeared in Cairo's satirical journal, Haygagan Sinema, Armenian Cinema. Titled The Force of Saving the Nation, the illustration depicts a struggle among contemporary Armenian political parties, represented by portly, tall, and tiny men, over the Armenian nation, Hay Ask, which is branded on the chest of an emaciated woman whose bare arms seem on the verge of being wrenched by the forces of the parties saving her. The caption reads, I quote, "In order to pluck the privilege of savior, they pull apart the poor nation without reflecting on what the nation endures in their hands," end quote. With these 2 cases, Boboch's 2 main targets, the intercommunal politics and women, come front and center. But here the latter, women, become the very tool by which the former, politics, receives the harshest rebuke. Thus, in both illustrations, women's bodies merely serve as a vehicle to drive home a point about party politics in a highly patriarchal society. We witness a shift in approach with Boboch's successor, Tsahavel, Birch Broom. Tsahavel's critique of women was often more aggressive than Boboch's, as it pursued women critics of the paper on its pages. Tsahavel also distinguished itself with didactic pieces and illustrations that juxtapose good and bad archetypes of womanly conduct, promoting an ideal woman who combined attributes of both modernity and modesty. By the 1950s, although Tsahavel had come to terms with some of modernity's encroachment and acknowledged the new modern woman, it was still driven by an anxiety. This anxiety boomed within the context of a growing women's movement with organized activity, public presence, and visibility, all of which challenged patriarchal norms and gender relations. Thus, Tsahavel sought to shape and contain the modern woman by advocating for her modesty, with all that implied for behavior, dress, character, morality, and reconfirming her place in the patriarchal order. The community's anxiety about Armenian women's increased public visibility and activism through independent women's organizations was plainly expressed in the conspicuously eye-catching, unsigned cover of the June 1st, 1951 issue entitled "Collective and Unanimous, the Church-Loving Women's Union is Building the Prelacy." It depicts the caricature of 5 middle-aged women, actual personalities and leaders, most of whom we've identified, of the Armenian Church-Loving Women's Union. Unlike the dominant Armenian women's organizations in Tabriz, Tehran, and Isfahan, from the outset, the Church-Loving Union was subservient to the priorities of the Armenian prelacy, having been created under its authority. Its primary goal, according to its bylaws, was, quote, "to assist the Armenian churches in their beautification," end quote. Thus, they were to play an ornamental role for the church while organizing lectures on religion and ethics. The 5 caricatures are depicted hard at work, doing what was traditionally a man's job, physically erecting the new building of the prelacy. Note the depiction of the church-loving members. In the front, in a pristinely white dress, stands a woman in a pile of mud, proudly holding 2 mud balls in her hands. A second, front right, stands in the shared mud pile, holding a shovel on which her right leg rests. A third, the oldest among them, back right, wears a bright red dress and moves out of the pictorial frame, carrying the front end of a hand barrow, while another, back center, holds its back end, looking away. Behind a half-constructed wall, a not yet identified figure with gray hair lays the bricks. The long caption is as enigmatic as the image, simultaneously praising and belittling both men and women in a mix of low-brow Tehrani, Armenian, and Persian, which loses a lot of its flavor in translation, but here it is nevertheless. Brava women. In these days, even man would not have this courage. Even if in the past you slipped slightly, this work of yours wiped all that. Money is a vile thing. It could bring calamity upon one's head, but the home will always remain. Brava women. Perhaps if Tehran's Women's Union sees your work and musters the courage, it too would build a theater and then a cultural house. Evil tongues say they too have money, end quote. In their Sunday best, with diverse styles and colors of bloomy blue, fluoridated red and white, and austere black and white, the women are depicted as if in the church courtyard at Easter celebration. Yet, at least 3 of them are stripped from thigh to toe and stand barefoot. A highly nuanced but certainly uncomfortable tension is created by this contrast. And still another, women taking on construction which otherwise they would not be allowed to do and for which, if they dared, they would be ostracized. Here, Tsahavel does not spare man. It questions Armenian men's masculinity by depicting women doing a man's job. As readers move to the related article on the second page, they discover that the initial seeming praise of the church-loving women is in effect a narratological strategy for criticizing them as they propose to construct a building to serve church or national needs. Tsahavel's disapproval is then juxtaposed with a call to the Armenian Women's Benevolent Society to rise to the occasion and divert the money from providing weekly breakfast to poor pupils to the more laudable effort of constructing a theater house or Armenian house of culture. Erecting either was, however, neither a priority nor in the toolbox of this organization, which still exists today, which cared exclusively for the poor and dispossessed. Intriguingly, the one self-proclaimed intellectual and cultural women's organization, the Armenian Woman Union, Haygin Miuchun, established by young women with feminist leanings in 1939, is absent from both the illustration and the article. So Tsahavel endorsed neither the new woman in her generational outlook, ideological priorities, and modernist appearance, nor the traditional church-loving or benevolent one. Tsahavel instead preferred to conceive and sculpt its own new woman. The cover page of Tsahavel's May 15, 1950 issue is its most revealing and representative piece of such an effort. The illustration by the artist pen-named Khaytuni, the one who has a stinger, which promotes the proper fashion for the modern yet modest Armenian woman by contrasting it with the unacceptable fashion of another, lays bare the paper's attempt to monopolize the discourse of modernity about women and to decide their proper place. Bobo's commentaries on women's behavior and fashion are outdone here with the introduction of a rich backdrop, Reza Shah's modern and sanitized urban fabric. The radical urban reforms of the mid-1930s that affected spatial organization and urban life, and the dress code changes coincided with, and at least in the case of urban modernization, continued under Mohammad Reza Shah. In this illustration, we see the dress code and urban makeovers begun in the 1930s come together. The cartoon depicts a crossing of two streets, where on one corner stands the Armenian newspaper press house, and the other a bar. The modern architecture with minimalist square windows, the Parisian street lamp, the clearly marked street and sidewalks are all incorporated into the caricature as indicators of the already fulfilled promise of Iranian modernity. The caption on the left appeals to the reader. Quote, "Here is a woman in front of you. Paint and makeup, latest fashion. There is no shame on her face. What else should I write about her?" End quote. On the right side of the image, where the modern yet modest woman is depicted, the caption reads, quote, "In her natural, exquisite appearance," excuse me, I'm getting very emotional. "In her natural, exquisite appearance, with a virtuous posture and modest face, she is the embodiment of a model woman. Respect and admiration to you, woman," end quote. The binary structure of the double column of the caption is faithfully echoed in the compositional arrangement of the drawing itself. They join to convey the equally binary ethical message of the good and the bad, the graced and the demeaned, the cultured and the commercial. Above this caption, modern Tehran is framed by two women, one portrayed as inappropriately dressed, the other appropriately clothed. The latter is represented here as a prototype of the modern yet modest. She is the new Armenian woman. Her skirt covering knees dressed in stockings, her long sleeve button-up collar shirt elegantly accessorized by a scarf. She is a far cry from Bobo's projection of fashion's future. The image hints at the fact that she has just left the press building with a rolled-up copy of Tsahavel in her hand, thus inferring to her obvious intellectual worth. Whereas the proper woman is leaving Tsahavel headquarters, her moral pictorial reverse is heading to a bar. The modest woman's judgmental gaze is directed toward the woman flanking the opposite side of the frame, who, with her buttocks confronting the reader, protruding oversized breasts, short skirt with a long slit exposing stockingless legs and high heels on newly paved sidewalks, is meant to give the impression of, at the very least, impropriety and perhaps even lasciviousness. And because of, quote, "no shame on her face," end quote, it is she who seeks and meets the gaze of the inferred male audience as men behind her stop and stare. In the back, a large Orwellian head, indeed the head of Tsahavel's chief editor and owner, Bazen, hovers over not just the good and the bad new women, but the public space where the Iranian women have now arrived. Here, Foucault's notion of the modernist gaze originates on the press building and the very eyes of the editor. Then it traverses to the modest woman whose eyes point to the immodest woman, and through her is returned to the viewer or reader. The gaze of the Orwellian Big Brother comes full circle. Despite this rigid binary, however, the depiction of the modern woman in both Armenian and Persian language periodicals was highly versatile in this discursive space of satire and caricature, ranging from the noble mother of the nation to the publicly available woman. On this Tsahavel cover, it is precisely this kind of discoursing policing by the editor of the paper that we witness. His moral binary of the ideal Armenian woman versus the undignified is mirrored by the graphic binary of the illustration. In conclusion, just as Camron Amin demonstrates in his analysis of photographs and cartoons appearing in the independent weeklies Merde Emruz, Today's Man, and Atesh, Fire, so too in our case. The illustrations on the pages of Bobokh and Sakhavel both reflect and direct views about women and gender. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Houri. Our next speaker is Professor Camron Michael Amin, who is a professor of history at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, a leading scholar on Iranian press and state feminism in 20th century Iran. His scholarship includes his first book, The Making of the Modern Iranian Woman, Gender, State Policy, and Popular Culture, 1865-1946, as well as his numerous articles, which we have benefited enormously from, Selling and Saving Mother Iran, Gender and the Iranian Press in the 1940s, Propaganda and Remembrance, Gender, Education, and the Women's Awakening of 1936, and Globalizing Iranian Feminism, 1910-1950. Amin served as the president of the Association of Iranian Studies from 2018 to 2020. And he is currently working on 2 oral history projects. They're called the Michigan Iranian American Oral History and the Modern Middle East Travelers Oral History. His talk is entitled Satire and Bigotry in Iranian Press Culture. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Today I do actually plan to revisit some of my earlier research on the Iranian press. I also plan to introduce some of my current research in oral history on Iranian Americans in Michigan. But my first bit of evidence today, Exhibit A, if you will, is going to feature an example not from the 19th or 20th centuries, but from the 21st. Exhibit A begins with a cartoon in a minor publication in Iran that blew up on the internet. I hear that happens. Hopefully not right now. And then came to the attention of the Western world, Iranian diaspora and Iranian studies scholars like me, although I realized it later than most people. Each of these exhibits reinforce points that I will open and close with. First, satire in the press can be usefully understood as one strategy among many that journalists have used to ward off both legal and extra-legal consequences for what they inject into public discourse. Second, and relatedly, I would say, the space that satire created to protect free speech in Iran, or attempted to protect free speech in Iran, also created some insulation from other kinds of accountability. It created space for ethnic bigotry and sexism to evolve with the press and go relatively unnoticed in the academy for years, although that has begun to change. Even those of us who have worked to understand gender discourse in the Iranian press and media have yet to dig as deeply as we should into the ethnocentric and sort of racist discourse that comes along with it. And that's why I'm so excited by all the work that's being presented today. And therefore, I think it's actually a bit of a mistake to only focus on past expressions of ethnic bigotry and misogyny without reflecting on how those ideas have actually distorted our study of Iran and the Middle East generally. We're kind of living with it. It's not just back then. When I first studied press sources, I was searching for ways in which gender was conceptualized around the time of a dramatic state feminism project in Iran in the 1930s. Nearly all the content that I paid attention to was earnest, didactic, and humorless, not the fun stuff you guys have been looking at. Ideologically inspired formulations of modern Iranian womanhood were not subtle about a racialized construction of Iranian national identity that privileged Persian speakers. But my analysis back then did not really dwell on that stuff. And state propaganda, while often striking me as funny and absurd, was rarely intentionally satirical. Revisiting my own work with fresh eyes has underscored to me how much I missed looking at that stuff at that time, especially when I consider that older press material alongside more recent media content and alongside some of the oral history narratives that I've been privileged to record. So let's start with a more recent media example. Exhibit A is this 2006 cartoon by Mana Neyestani. I've included a translation of some of the text that accompanied the cartoon because I think it makes it easier to see what the problem with it is, although maybe the picture would grab you right away. This Azeris as Cockroaches cartoon generated protests in Azerbaijan and Iran. Neyestani and a colleague found themselves arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to abusive treatment, the kind that the Iranian governments past and present have become all too notorious for. The state reaction to Neyestani, I want to emphasize, was unjustified because this sort of thing should never lead to the kind of state reprisals and sense of threat that ultimately drives Neyestani from Iran and his family from Iran to flee. Furthermore, Neyestani has rightly been celebrated for his work on promoting peace and human rights in Iran and around the world. But even as we reject what happened to Neyestani, we should also reflect on the Western and academic reaction to the cartoon and its consequences. Here is Neyestani himself talking with our colleague Persis Karim in 2015. Most Western media and academic reflections that I have looked at on this episode have tended to accept at face value that Neyestani, who is reportedly of Azeri-Iranian heritage himself, and who in his own words was aware of the history of ethnic slurs against Azeris in Iranian culture, that somebody couldn't anticipate the fuss this might create. In any case, Neyestani's indulgence of anti-Azeri bigotry in this cartoon mostly evaded accountability in academia and in the diaspora. And we can see that in this 2018 assessment. But why? Why is this happening? Why do we miss stuff or don't react to it maybe as we ought to? Part of the answer is the fact that modern Iranian culture, including the popular press, since the 19th century, has been shaped by formulations of Iranian nationalism that have privileged Persian speakers, that have downplayed ethnic and religious diversity in Iran, and have racialized expressions of Iranianness to align it better with European and later on American whiteness. The work of Neda Makbouleh and others has been shedding more light on this fact of life in the Iranian diaspora, and the work of Reza Zia Ebrahimi and Bita Baghalizadeh and others have been excavating the history of this process in Iran itself. Taken together, this represents one layer of what is going on with this Azeri cockroach episode. We, in Iranian studies academia, are not always seeing the ethnic marginalization that is entwined with the other cultural processes that we study. But there's another layer that is tied to the history of the press itself. There's a version of Iranian press history that always aligns journalists with the most noble and enlightened socio-political ideals of the modern period. Not so much today. And with this framing, though, there are just a few short periods of time in Iranian history. 1906 to 1911, 1941 to 53, parts of 78, parts of 79, in which journalists in Iran were free to be their best selves. Otherwise, journalists are toiling in exile, or as Mohammad Massoud, the publisher of Today's Man, might have put it before he was assassinated in 1948, for being a journalist, journalists are the flowers that grow in hell. This narrative, I want to emphasize, doesn't overstate the risk to journalists and the problems with free speech and all that. That's all real, of course. But further research into the history of the press, and here I would recommend the recent work of Negin Nabavi to you, reveals a more complicated picture. We need to remember that the Iranian press began as a state project in the 19th century. Press laws, even those originating in the constitutional period, put limits on free speech, and over the years, successive parliaments have increased the regulatory and financial pressures on journalism. So even when the state wasn't organizing and policing messages in the press and other media, journalists had to be wary of losing publishing licenses, being tried for violation of press laws, in addition to any extra-legal violence that might be visited upon them. Satire was one of the many stances a journalist could use to ward off or attempt to ward off these risks. Satire was a tool to prevent accountability to a repressive state. Neyestani was confronted both with state oppression and public criticism. And it was just easier for us to focus on the journalist as hero part of the story, which is real. It was easier for us to downplay the part of the story that resonated with the uncomfortable legacies of ethnic racism in modern Iranian culture. If we think of satire as a tactic, and as Babak Rahimi notes, one that can be deployed in many forms, we can see how it can function to create a layer of deniability to ward off government censures, but also as a way to downplay harm. even violence associated with bigotry expressed in satirical form. And where bigotry is concerned, be it sort of anti-ethnic groups or say racist or sexist, it's the press as a whole we should take into account, I think, and not just overtly satirical content. And I basically feel that one of the things I find interesting and productive for me is to find these tiny little instances of satire in otherwise really sober and didactic content, not trying to be funny, not trying to be trenchant, but it jumps out a little here and there. The next set of slides revisit the press sources. I promised you I would, and I am going to. Like, when is he going to get to the slides? They're coming. This is from these are from Making the Modern Iranian Woman, coming on its 20-year anniversary, actually. So go out and buy an additional copy to go along with the one you already have. The central question of the book was, why did State Feminism Project, known as the Women's Awakening, which I should underscore, was a massive national social engineering project under Reza Shah Pahlavi with tangible effects. It wasn't just media stuff. Have the priorities that it did. Why did it work so hard to fulfill a project predicated on advancing opportunities for women that also insisted on restraining women's political and personal liberties? My answer to this question was based on an observation that even though the Pahlavi state had an unparalleled latitude to operationalize any domestic policy it wanted in the 1930s, its imagination was actually shaped, constrained, defined a bit by woman question debates that had come on for decades prior. And in these debates, two competing frames for modern Iranian womanhood, as both women being increasingly capable, but increasingly dangerous. And as Houri's noted, and Yasemin as well, the danger becomes greater the closer women get to being actually independent of the men in their lives. That's the trouble spot. In other words, the Pahlavi state embraced a version of complementary rights feminism that Beth Barron has discussed in reference to Egypt, and I think we can maybe agree dominated the woman question really through the middle of the 20th century. But in so doing, by giving the fullest possible symbolic expression of women's capability that nonetheless restrained their independence, the Pahlavi State's Women's Awakening Project set the stage in certain ways for equal rights feminism in the Iranian public discourse. There was one policy issue in the 20th century that contained the conceptual Rubicon that if crossed, if this happened, if this terrible thing happened, would sort of signal Iranian women's break from male guardianship. And as you've anticipated, it's suffrage is the issue. That's the thing. If that happens, that's the end. What's important to remember is that, for this discussion today, is that there was an unprecedented women's suffrage campaign that followed the Women's Awakening from 1944 to 1946, led by a coalition of women's groups who framed the issue as often as not in terms of equal rights, not just complementary rights. And that was new at the time. Okay, to the actual slides. This image from 1861 was published in the first durable state gazette, the Chronicle of Events. And it reminds us that the press began as a state project and that Iranian women were utilized in state propaganda even when the woman question was not a thing and there was no state feminist project on the horizon. By the 1920s, though, it was not hard to find traditional women satirized as a burden to Iranian men, with European models of domestic life serving as the sort of an aspirational foil. But let's consider two images produced during the Women's Awakening period proper, both from the youth magazine Meghrouni on the subject of marriage. Marriage reform, as much as education reform, was an essential part of complementary rights feminism, and as a policy issue that the Pahlavi state actually engaged in 1931, years before its more dramatic Women's Awakening project. These examples from 1938 and 39, we see Iranian women being placed in a racial hierarchy. The conceit here was an essay contest. This is a very serious thing, by the way. I find it funny, but it was really serious to this magazine. Iranian women, like their modern counterparts pictured here, in all their European variety, with one exception, were supposed to imagine their ideal husbands. It's an essay contest. And as you can see, certain women of the world are represented way more than others. And the nameless women of the world in these pictures imagined their ideal husbands that fulfilled fulfilled certain stereotypes about these nations that they're representing. As we can see here from the winners of the essay contest, the Iranian women whose essays were published, spoiler, they all wanted patriotic Iranian men who would die for Iran. That was, so in case you're wondering what the bar is, will you die for Iran is the bar. Women are not nameless. But other than their names, you know very little else about them, because the essays are, of course, not about them. Nobody cares what they really think. An omission that I see more clearly now than I did 22 years ago is any sense of their ethnic or religious background. We might wonder with Miss Khazayel, for example, if she had any thoughts about her Arab heritage, however distant that might be in her family's history at the moment, in this moment. Even if one might infer Arab or Kurdish or Azeri heritage from the names, there's no visual cues or anything in the text that considers the women to be anything except minor variations on a Euro-equivalent modern Iranian woman, per the logic of the State Feminism Project. Now let me jump ahead to 1946. After the Women's Awakening and during the aforementioned women's suffrage campaign, while it was still underway, to this page from the newspaper Atesh, which we got a shout out, thank you, I appreciate it. Here it is again. Here you can see that even when women had the opportunity to share a letter to the editor with an equal rights message about suffrage, it would be balanced, fox before fox, with an opposing letter and framed in sort of a generally frivolous discussion. The world of women, arts, literature, not politics, not policy. It wasn't given that gravitas. It wasn't accorded that. This same publication did also represent women as capable, in line with the pattern set with the state press during the Women's Awakening. But in the issue of suffrage, that hot-button, terrifying issue, that served as a symbolic proxy for women's equal rights and independence from men in Iranian society at that time, the misogynist and satirical gloves sort of come off. Now let's bring ethnic bigotry back into focus with an example from the same period, same year, same paper, but with a much different issue, and it'll move us into the territory that we began with Exhibit A. I have a point, I really do. I'm coming to it, it's on its way. The collapse of state authority in World War II revived ethnic separatism in Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, Khuzestan with lethal consequences. In my second work on the Iranian press, which also got a shout out, thank you, I puzzled over the gender discourse in an Iranian press that was increasingly sensational due to both increased political partisanship and commercial competition. National vulnerability, Iran's risk of losing Azerbaijan was often feminized in text and in graphic representation. And these portrayals could be even more shocking during the hyper-partisan, hyper-competitive press world of the 1940s. This image, informed as it is by actual military violence, pulls out all the stops to portray Azeri separatists as essentially foreign, much like the Kurds in Turkey, as it's resonating with me. They don't really belong there. They are tools of the Soviet Union, raping and pillaging on their way to retreating across the border. It would be very easy to see this only in its historical context, only in the sort of immediacy of what was going on, and not really keep in mind Exhibit A. We don't know what this cartoonist actually thought about Azeris, or if these images, how they were processed or even noticed at the time. The fact that I noticed them doesn't mean anybody else did. This is where my other line of research has been helpful to me, getting a sense of things. Oral history can give us some insight into the way bigotry lives in sort of daily life and in memory. And let me turn to some examples from what I'm going to call Exhibit C, oral history. I can tell you too much about this project in Q&A, so I won't go into the Michigan Iranian American Oral History Project in detail now. And I'm thinking I'm also going to just jump right to the clips because they kind of make sense in their own way. One of the things I love about oral history is people speak for themselves. Professors shut up and listen. But let me just say this is an interview that I did with Dr. Shahpour Ansari, who's an Azeri Iranian. And that's the tie-in to the way he remembers how bigotry impacted him, both during this period I just talked about, the separatist moment in 1946, but later in his life. And I think it gives a sense of immediacy. It'll take a second for it to spool up. I don't know why I thought it was important for me to leave this 10 seconds of spooling up. Do we have sound when it comes up? We're going to find out. When he starts talking, we'll know. The presentation rides on this.
Just put some in Facebook. I put the picture of the 4 dictators. Reza Shah, then Stalin, and then Muhammad Reza Shah, then Khomeini. I say my life has been 82 years spent under influence of those 4 dictators. That's a shame, and that's really amazing, I have to say. The only dictator who gave us a freedom of speech about our language, our culture, our music is Stalin.
It's not often that Stalin's the hero of a story. I waited months to give you that joke. I just had to. Dr. Ansari was a very successful cardiac surgeon, he's retired now. And he did experience sort of bias as a Middle Eastern immigrant here, but he actually felt that the grief he got from Persian speakers in Iran was more powerful. Even though he was respected for his talents back there, it always stayed with him. And this next excerpt from the 1960s, where he talks about an incident where he's confronting a professor on behalf of his fellow students. And what he's going to do is ask for a delay in a medical exam, because all the students are swamped, they want a delay. And he was chosen to talk to these guys about it. But his Azeri heritage is kind of thrown in his face.
But I was discriminated in Iran because of my language and insulted. There was a doctor by name Nasser Giti. He was supposed to be trained in America, but later I found him only he worked in the lab here. He never had to touch the patient. So he had no degree onto practice medicine yet. So anyway, he was very well thought of because he spoke a little English. And so we want to delay this exam. And we are 318 students in medical school. They decided 3 of the top scoring students go talk to this Dr. Nasser Giti. And they chose me, one of them, 2 other guys. We went over there to talk to him that if he gave us 10 more days, because there was several exams back to back. There was so much gap in between. We wanted to, if we put this Trajectories 5-6 days later, that we have time to refresh our study. So we went to see him, and he was coming from the steps of the medical school. I don't know if you saw Tehran Medical School. It's very nice. I just saw him video. I was watching, nostalgic. I watched my medical school. Beautiful. French, they designed it. So steps he was coming down, and we went over there. I started talking what we want. He said, شما بفرق آقا من از آذربایجانی خوشم میاد صحبت بکنم. بذار اینا صحبت کنم.
Yeah, I said wow right there. So, I hope you can see why I find oral history so compelling. What I think these clips help do is remind us that the stuff we're seeing in the press, the stuff that we're finding there, the emotions behind it, the real life consequences behind it, they're not sort of they're not frozen in archival amber. They're kind of with us, and that kind of leads me to where I began. I'll close the same way. Satire in the Iranian press culture is reinforced gender and ethnic hierarchy because the Iranian press did so generally. And we overlook it or minimize it here and there at times, maybe all the time, because we're not free from the ethnic racism and sexism of the Iranian past any more than we are free of that in our diasporic context. If we think of Iranian studies scholars as part of the Iranian diaspora. So that's why the line of research that my colleagues are following here, really, I'm the oldie. They're the new hits. It's really important because to bring these cultural patterns into view, so we can move beyond just noticing them or reckoning with them in the past, but maybe move more actively towards implementing overdue changes in society. Yes, let's be utopian a bit. Why not? But also in academia, we can actually fix some of that. Anyway, thank you very much.
And our final speaker is Dr. Nadia von Maltzahn, who is a research associate at the Orient Institute Beirut, wherein she directs the Lebanon's Art World at Home and Abroad, Trajectories of Artists and Artworks from Lebanon since 1943 project. She is the co-editor of Insights into Cultural Policies in Lebanon, which is a study of the legal framework regulating the Lebanese cultural sector. She's also the author of two articles published in 2019 entitled Heritage, Tourism, and the Politics of National Pride, the Baalbek International Festival in Lebanon, and the Museum as an Egalitarian Space, Women Artists in Beirut's Sursok Museum in the 1960s and the 1970s. Her talk is entitled A Thoughtful Exaggeration, Lebanon's Early Independent Period Through the Eyes of Dearborn. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. On 10th May 1954, Lebanese Armenian caricaturist Diran Ajemian gave a lecture at the Sinak Libanais. The Sinak Libanais, founded in 1946 in the wake of Lebanon's independence from France in 1943, was a cultural platform with the principal aim of giving a space to participate in the cultural formation and consolidation of a Lebanese identity. Entitled Caricature and Its Role, Diran elaborated on his art. I quote, "Young and old, intellectuals and illiterates are interested in caricature, which is often more understandable, more explanatory, and clearer than an article. It explains better and is faster. One prefers it to text. But I think that one does not yet have a clear idea about this art. That is why I take this occasion to show that caricature is not a minor art, as it is claimed, but that, on the contrary, it is a major art, in the real sense of the word. Caricature is an exaggeration, but it is a thoughtful exaggeration, an intentional and intelligent deformation. Human nature remains the same throughout the ages, but customs change. That is why, when the caricaturist, in a few pen strokes, ridicules his contemporaries, he does not just make a moral satire, but even more so a social satire. His drawing is the reflection of his time," unquote. Thus explains Diran his art, which he considered a mirror of society. It was the first of a series of lectures in both Armenian and French on the role of caricature that he gave throughout his life, striving for caricature to be taken seriously as an art form. Today I take a selection, so it's a bit of a different approach, selection of Diran, so one person's satire, as an entry point to explore the multi-layered reality of Lebanon in its early independent period, with a special focus on the political and press culture, Armenian agency, and women as objects and subjects. Before I begin, I would like to thank Diran's daughter, Sylvia, for allowing me to reproduce his drawings throughout this talk. So unless otherwise stated, they come from this publication that she did in 2017. Who was Diran? Diran Ajemian was born into an Armenian merchant family in Aleppo, Syria in 1904. Having attended a German school, he was on his way to continue his studies in Germany at age 16 when he stopped in Constantinople. Fascinated by the cultural life of the metropolis, he stayed and started working at Gavroche, an Armenian satirical review. Oops, it's moving on its own. When his father died unexpectedly in 1921, he returned to Aleppo and then in 1926 installed himself in Beirut, where he remained until his death. He quickly became part of a clique. In this drawing of 1934, Diran and his friend Dikran Tosbath stand out. In 1947, Tosbath launched one of the main Francophone daily newspapers, Le Soir, to which Diran contributed regularly. Not able to live from his talent as a caricaturist, he worked as a head designer at the Beirut port and then as a designer at the hydraulic and electrical administration until 1969. In 1945, Diran visited Egypt, where he met Alexander Saruhan, whose work he admired and that you can find on the poster for today's colloquium. A friendship developed between them. In his 1945 lecture at the Sinak Libanais, I don't know why it's moving, he honored Saruhan by underlining the impact he has had in developing caricature in Egypt. As for Lebanon, he charts the development of caricature as starting with the founding of the satirical political weekly at Dearborn in 1922, followed by a Sayat in the mid-1940s. Diran joined at Dearborn, which means wasp, in 1943 and stayed with the review for 3 decades. Here you can see two of his early covers of 1944, one dedicated to Lebanon and the Mahra, the literary diaspora in the Americas, and the other a woman complaining to the Dabur, who is holding a banner reading, "Exchange of diplomats, recognizing independence, appoint the political core," exclaiming she did not care about the political core, being more worried about the state of the economy. Iran continued his overview of the satirical press, I quote. "As for the daily political newspapers and reviews in Arabic and French, we can say that caricature does not exist. They ignore it. One contents oneself with some selected reproductions. What concerns humorous drawing in Lebanon, there's a whole education to be done for the newspapers and the public. There are many reasons for the absence of humorous drawings in the local reviews and dailies. Usually the budget is cited, but that is a bad reason. One has to rather attribute it to the indifference of journalists and the lack of public demand," unquote. While Iran laments the state of satire in daily print journalism, both periodicals and daily newspapers that did reproduce caricatures were widely read by the 1940s. Hala Auji argues that already in the late 19th century, printed, I quote, "printed Arabic books, journals, newspapers, and booklets became the forums through which a middle-class public sphere was formed and where new notions of the public were shaped," unquote. The readership of print journalism grew steadily through 1945 as literacy expanded and the number of periodicals rose. Writing about Lebanon and Syria of the late Mandate period, historian Elizabeth Thompson shows how, I quote, "major newspapers became organs of the various political parties, offering partisan, contentious, and competing visions of the ideal civic order," unquote, while the government shaped the debate through censorship. This was no different in the early independence period, in which journalists were outspoken to criticize the government. The young Lebanese nation was divided from the start between a westward-looking, Christian-dominated group and a pan-Arab group that saw Lebanon's place anchored in the Middle East. This latter formed the post-independence government with Bashar al-Houri as president and Riyad al-Solh as prime minister, who agreed on the National Pact, the foundation of the Lebanese state, which stipulated that Lebanon's president would always be a Maronite Christian, its prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament a Shia Muslim. The first parliamentary election of independent Lebanon on 25th May 1947, in which the previous government was largely re-elected, was widely criticized for alleged fraud. Here on the slide you can see the outgoing Prime Minister Riyad al-Solh crowning the incoming Prime Minister Riyad al-Solh, and al-Solh and the Druze leader and outgoing and incoming Minister of Telecommunications and Defense, Majid Aslan, watching politicians present their resignations. The oppositional Lebanese National Bloc Party published a pamphlet entitled "The Crime of May 25, How the Parliamentary Elections in Mount Lebanon Took Place in 1947. I quote, "The ballots of the victors were stolen from the ballot boxes, and their votes added to those cast for the government slate. That is why May 25, 1947 became the date of a national tragedy. Might conquered right, laws became chaos, dictatorship replaced the constitution, falsehoods and forgeries replaced facts, and the criminals responsible for all this were the heads of the government and their subordinates." The pamphlet, unquote, "The pamphlet is a report of what happened during the elections, followed by a collection of statements. Its aim was to expose the government, which it considered unlawful, showing the multitude of voices that spoke out against the elections." An English translation, which you can see here, was published in New York to appeal to the American public for support. I quote, "The Lebanon stands now at the crossroads. Is it to become a fifth wheel to the pan-Islamic chariot against the will of the great majority of the people, or is it to carry on its own national existence in its own way? In this struggle for the soul of a country, the people of the Lebanon need and deserve the help of that very potent factor, democratic American public opinion," unquote. The fact that the Lebanese political party so actively lobbied for US support demonstrates to what extent politicians considered themselves dependent on international backing, as you can see also in this sketch of March 1945, where Syria and Lebanon are praying to San Francisco, while the Allied leaders, de Gaulle, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, are plotting in the background. Ghassan Twaini, journalist and founder of the Lebanese daily An-Nahar, which is until today one of the leading newspapers, described how the May 1947 elections removed any kind of effective opposition in parliament, which meant that the press took on this role, as it used to in Ottoman times. The press got to feel the weight of this role. Here you can see the prime minister trying to behead the press, a woman again, for hitting President Bashar al-Houri along the way. Journalists regularly ended up behind bars. Here you can see that Saleh guarding the prison, which was renamed Press House, and a whole group of journalists who were imprisoned in June 1952, so following on from, or again going against that, were imprisoned in June 1952 after reprinting a caricature of President Bashar al-Houri that was published in Al-Anbar, one of the dailies. Georges Naash, founder of the Francophone newspaper L'Orient, went to prison for 3 months following his famous editorial, "Two Negations Do Not Make a Nation," of March 1949. In it, he warned that the independent state was doomed to perpetual violence, as it was founded on 2 negations, neither Occident nor Arabization, as agreed in the National Pact of November 1943, which established full independence from France on the one hand, and abandoning any claims to unite with Syria on the other. The tension that was inherent to the makeup of the Lebanese state that was founded on a compromise has accompanied Lebanon to this day. One effect of this multi-layered reality of Lebanon was that every community could carve out a space for itself. The sectarian structure guaranteed some degree of political power to all confessions. Armenian political parties benefited from this and modified their political platforms to adjust to the new political theater of Lebanon. Beirut had become home to a large Armenian community by 1944, the largest urban concentration of Armenians in the Arab world. Armenians in Lebanon were much more internally divided than other confessions, partly as a result of the Cold War. As Zolin Nalbantian shows in her book Armenians Beyond Diaspora, Armenian parties in Lebanon mirrored the ideological positions of the Cold War superpowers, with the left wing and Communist Party supporting the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, while the Nationalist Party did not. This heterogeneity was also reflected in the Armenian press in Lebanon, that was and still is very active. Here you can see a sketch published in the newspaper of the nationalist right-wing Dashnak Party, Aztak, which shows the satirist Turik being punished for how he described the different provinces of Armenia. Armenians in Lebanon considered themselves invested in the country, while at the same time being Armenian. They were active members of the Lebanese nation-state. They also played an important role in Lebanon's culture and intellectual life, both in terms of Armenian culture and the arts more generally. Here you can see Levon Shant, the long-term director of the Armenian Nishan Palangian School in Beirut, securing important funds for a school from the USA during his visit in 1948. Sorry, it moves a bit faster than me on its own. Armenian writer and poet Gosta Anzarian spent a few years in Beirut in the early 1950s, where he taught history of Armenian culture at the American University of Beirut, AUB. We can read in AUB's Outlook journal, I quote, "This marks a milestone in the ever-growing scope of the university curriculum, all the more so as it provides a unique opportunity for students of Armenian extraction to study their own nation's artistic achievements at a university level, a privilege which was so far not available for them in the Middle East," unquote. Zarian was best known for his novel The Ship on the Mountain, referenced in the drawing. And it was his arrival in Beirut that prompted a group of Armenian alumni of the AUB to approach the university to set up this course. While creating a vibrant cultural life for the Armenian community, Armenians were also very active in the wider Lebanese artistic scene. Here you can see Paul Giragosyan, one of Lebanon's best-known modern painters. So, in fact, artists of Armenian origins are were very prolific in Lebanon's art world, and it is one of the aims of my wider research project to analyze why this is the case. I would now like to turn to women's rights and the representation of women in the early independent period. In the Black Book of the Lebanese Elections of 1947, several pages are dedicated to women's voices. The, I quote, women of Beirut are quoted as stating, I quote, "We, the women of Beirut, have been forbidden the right to participate in the elections, a right which is our natural privilege as citizens of Lebanon. But we cannot be forbidden to raise our voices in protest at that which happened," unquote. Likewise, the Arab Lebanese Ladies Union sent a telegram to the president asking him to, I quote, "use his authority and dissolve this parliament which was elected illegally," unquote. It also reports on a meeting of the, I quote, "ladies of the city and of the mountain," who came to discuss the present situation and decide what they could do to fulfill their duty as citizens of their country. unquote. Women obtained suffrage in the early 1950s, but had been asking for political participation. This sketch of 1944 is telling. In an issue of Ad-Dabour dedicated to women's rights, the issue was entitled, you can see the cover, "The Woman is the Head of the Man," and you can see a shy man knitting in the background. One drawing showed a fierce and angry woman threatening a helpless man, entitled, "When Women Enjoy Their Political and Social Rights." The caption reads, "The wife, have I not told you, don't you dare leave the children before I come back from Parliament?" It clearly shows the potential danger of emancipation and granting women political power. They lose their femininity and turn into all but monsters. This image was no exception. Thompson recounts it in the 1930s. I quote, Ad-Dabour published articles on how education made women poor housekeepers and a regular column on why men prefer to remain bachelors. The browbeaten husband and overbearing wife became common images. Other than emancipated wives, women were widely portrayed as objects of desire. In 1950, Divan created the character of Rantouz. He explains in his 1954 lecture, I quote, "In the story without words, the action takes place in a continuous movement. The drawing is composed of 3 or 4 paintings. It is a real comedy, with its exhibition, its development, and happy ending that is unexpected or amusing. In America and Europe, these kinds of drawings are very much in demand. I have created in Lebanon the adventures of Rantouz that appear periodically in the Soir and Ad-Dabour. Rantouz is the Lebanese village type who is very intelligent, curious, spiritual, and likable. He is a made-up personality by borrowing the tabouche, the hat of the Atzol, the masbaha, the prayer beads of Ibrahim Haidar, and the stick of Majid Aslan. He is everywhere, he observes, laughs, and criticizes. Here you can see men enjoying an art exhibition. The statue is entitled Spring. The gallerist asks Rantouz what he's waiting for, to which he answers, fall. Probably at the same time that he created this typical Lebanese village type, Divan edited a series of postcards showing typical everyday Lebanese people or scenes. The contrast between these everyday scenes and how women were shown in modern society at the same time is clear. Here, the morality police is requesting women at the beach to undress. Do you think you're at home? Get up and take off these clothes. And a 2-piece bikini bathing suit is forbidden. It needs to be 1 piece. The woman at the right is asking for some iodine at the pharmacy. Women were highly sexualized, not only in society, but also as objects of desire for politicians. In these 2 sketches, you can see the new leader of the National Bloc, Raymond Addé, flirting on the beach, and the Minister of Public Works, Druze leader Kamal Jumblat, doing so at the ministry. In his satirical drawings for newspapers and reviews, Divan mainly depicted anonymous women. In a 1969 interview with the 5 leading caricaturists in Lebanon, of whom Divan was the doyen, they point out that, I quote, "While caricaturists are fond of politicians, they rarely attack women. By a peculiar grace, the weaker sex is spared. To a great extent, they're denouncing pencil." Unquote. Divan had already complained a decade earlier that humor was not appreciated in Lebanon as it should be, that subjects were limited, and that Lebanese women did not lend themselves to caricature. Occasionally, Divan did show women as subjects rather than objects. Some of these were shown as part of a series of portraits of prominent figures in Lebanon's intellectual, political, and social life that he exhibited in his first solo exhibition at Aleko Saab Gallery in Beirut in 1961. Here on the right, we can see the novelist, journalist, and feminist Siran Cesar. Her feminist magazine, The Young Armenian Woman, founded in Beirut in 1932, aimed to bring Armenians into the global conversation on women's rights. Other than strengthening women's awareness of their civic and legal rights, Cesar encouraged Armenian women to learn Arabic and to participate in the Armenian community and Lebanese society more broadly. There were a number of women's magazines founded in the 1910s and 1930s, which gave women a platform to present their vision of the role of women in their community, challenging the male-dominated press's imagined civic order. Going back to Divan's lecture at the Cenacle Libanais, I quote, "One has to reject the idea that caricature is a minor art like some pretend, and that it is a branch of painting that has only limited possibilities. This is a mistake. Caricature is an art, a very difficult art, that requires conditions as profound as any other art. It does not seem to us exaggerated to affirm that one is born a caricaturist like one is born a poet. Caricature is a form of portrait. The artist works always from nature. His source of inspiration is society, from which he draws other subjects. Tehran continuously battled to get caricature accepted as an art form and to establish it as a profession. In an interview in the late 1950s, he complained how journals often imposed a subject which made cartoonists get bogged down in routine, losing their artistic talents, and that newspapers either paid badly or not at all. His service to the country was recognized, however. He received in 1956 a first-class medal of the Ministry of National Education and Fine Arts in recognition of his services to the press and the arts. Throughout the decades, he collaborated with a large number of the leading French, Arabic, and Armenian language press in Lebanon. He did not spare any politician. You have a good collection of them in this revival sketch of Rantous in 1975, in which he searches for the person responsible, doing the tour of the politicians until he ends up looking at himself in the mirror. To conclude, we can say that Iran's art was indeed a reflection of his time. In his own words, if the humorist is modern and sees well, he adds to the philosophical value of his work a first-class documentary value. Through his sketches of politicians, events, and leading personalities in Lebanon's political, social, and cultural life, he documents the many faces of a country finding its identity as a modern nation. While women as subjects feature only marginally, their struggles are shown in the juxtaposition of the overbearing, monstrous wife and the beautiful woman as an object of desire. The press is also symbolized as a woman, to be beheaded. I have only shown you a glimpse of it today, but Iran documented the world of Armenians in Lebanon in great detail, which was both taking place in parallel and very much within Lebanon's political and cultural life. I would like to finish by showing two last caricatures of Tehran. On the left, you can see the artists Jean Khalife, Michel Basbous, and Eli Kanaan, entitled The Three Friends. The role of friendships, networks, and institutions are central to my current research project, LAWHA, in which we examine the professionalization of Lebanon's art world since independence. Special focus, as I had mentioned, is on the representation of artists of Armenian origin and of women artists. The image on the right shows Nicolas Sursok gifting his mansion to the city of Beirut, which was to become the Sursok Museum, Lebanon's leading museum of modern and contemporary art. And it was this image that introduced me to Tehran. So, thank you. Sorry for speaking so fast. Someone moved on its own.
Thank you. I would like to invite all the speakers, are really amazing papers, which weren't coordinated, but so many overlaps. Please join us for Q&A. I'll take a few questions from the audience, and we'll also take probably one question from the live stream. Any questions, comments?
Hello. So we have a question from one of our online viewers. They were wondering, it's for anyone who would like to answer, have you found any parallels in the media from your research with the present day media?
Oh, you just right to me? Okay, yes. Well, I think I mean, of course, the things are very different now. One of the things that maybe I'll go with the difference. One difference, and I think we see it actually in the Neyestani example, is the sense that his work getting away from him in the public discourse, where when it blows up, it becomes addressed and criticized, and the state comes after him, there's maybe more of a sense that you're more aware of the lack of control over your creation, of what you put out there, and it's made manifest maybe, and maybe that's a difference. That said, there is, at least in the Iranian side, and I'm sure in your examples as well, there's a long tradition of letters to the editor that I think is actually understudied, where it's if you imagine the sort of early equivalents of the comment section that you on online, where people throw everything and anything. Of course, these were mediated. They were often, but they would give some reaction that some editors felt the obligation to include in subsequent issues. And that was one way we get a picture of the public reaction even before the public can interact instantly and right away like it does today.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just maybe not directly to the question, but one thing I found really striking was how the images are so similar across the countries, and the subjects. I mean, it's so. Some of the images I've seen from you today that could have been in Lebanon. I mean,
Same thought.
Completely. So I just wonder. I mean, whether this is it draws of what does it is it just continue kind of. I don't know if it's European or traditional. I mean, where does this? The images are very similar. Where do they come from?
Well, I know in the Iranian case, many of the folks who are participating in the early, especially in the formative stages, but I think afterward, they're paying attention to what's happening regionally. And by the 40s, you also have some Iranian participants in the press or journalists and publishers who've actually gone to Europe in the 30s to get some education. So I think they're paying attention. What people don't often, I think, realize about the press is that a lot of the news is informed by the telegraph. It's sort of it's the printout from the internet of its day, which was the telegraph. And so if you think about sort of early globalized communities, you might think of journalists as in that bucket, and that would be true in Lebanon and Iran.
Yeah.
And I think likewise, they're seeing each other's cartoons. So I've seen examples where in a single issue, sometimes commonly some of the satirical journals would include 3 or 4 foreign cartoons, and they'd just say foreign cartoons, and then they translate them. And sometimes you see a foreign cartoon from a couple weeks ago, and the same concept showing up, uncited on the cover of an Akbaba journal. There have been some that also have the same concept in the same issue too, which I think is really thrilling. Like, oh, this person is not trying to hide it either.
And in Iran's and Turkey's case, I wouldn't be surprised, and I mean, I would not rule out the influence of the South Caucasian newspapers, especially the satirical papers coming out of Tbilisi, especially for the early 20th century period, not just Europe.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much. It's amazing how the papers talk to each other in such interesting ways. I wanted to say you took me back to my childhood. I knew Diran very, very well. His wife was my French teacher, and when I was in elementary school, I interviewed him for the school paper. He was a very patient and very nice man. I wrote a horrible little article, but anyway. But it was interesting to me that some of the images you showed I knew so well, but a lot of the political imagery, especially from the 40s, I was seeing these for the first time. So it's really interesting what becomes the legacy of Diran at a particular point in time and what doesn't. So thank you, and maybe you can talk about that if you feel that you want to. I wanted to ask all the panelists this question of, is there any way to know what the popular reaction of these sometimes incredibly provocative images are? Houri, for example, the image that really insults these very respectable women of high society in Tehran, who are the church ladies, and they're being depicted in a very insulting way. So is there a sense of what the reaction was? And Yasemin, I know from your other brilliant work on the beautiful baby competition of one of those journals that you know a lot about readers' reactions to these papers. So I was wondering if you could talk about that. Is there any way to recover what readers' reactions were at the time? Thank you.
Okay. We don't know what their reaction is, unfortunately. We do know, in general terms, that the newspapers were very popular because when we look at Armenian language newspapers in Iran, there are very few that had as long lives as these two. So Alik is one that actually has started in 1930 and has survived till today. And there are only one or two others that have had as long lives as Bobokh and Tsahavel. And some of them are children's newspapers or periodicals that are geared towards children. So the fact that these satirical journals had such long lives indicates to me that they were very popular. That, to me, indicates that they spoke to people in a way that other newspapers did not. But in terms of a particular reaction to things like that, or the very explicit, I don't know if you noticed one of the illustrations showed a woman, bare-breasted, and you couldn't see the caption. She was commenting on the short sleeves of the woman behind her. While the man with her, who was bald, was commenting on the short hair of the man behind them. So, obviously making a point. But, these are pretty provocative, as you said, but apparently acceptable.
I would just echo the longevity is one metric that I also think about, especially as you get, at a certain point in Iran, there's enough general literacy, apparently, that newspapers and journals could aspire to having enough subscribers. In other words, it wasn't just ad revenue, but it was also, whereas I would say before, having some sort of state patronage was also what would sometimes be a better indicator of how well you would do, or state tolerance, or some subvention going on that would make it possible. A lot of the expatriate journals, they're tied to Iranian merchant communities in different parts of the Middle East, and that's what gives them enough commercial sort of wherewithal. Circulation may also be one thing, but that can also be misleading. But you're usually kind of trying to infer. One area in the Iranian case is sometimes there are sort of case files about newspapers, and the current Iranian government loves to disgorge the archives of the previous Iranian governments around press and so on. And sometimes we get some sense of reports and reactions to various things. But yeah, sometimes you see a name, you see a picture, you really don't know much more beyond it. And that is one of the frustrating things, I would say, in the work that I've done with the press.
Yeah, and as far as how the cartoons are perceived, or whether they're accepted or appreciated, there's really not a lot, like everyone else has said, not a lot of proof of one way or the other. What you do see is if a cartoon is too risque, then the magazine will get fined. And then you'll hear about it from the magazine in the next week. We got fined, what are the limits of free speech? There'll usually be a little column. And at one point I found one where they go off on this rant about modesty. And so I went back to see which cartoon got fined, because they don't censor it. You can't censor it after the fact. It comes out and then you get hit with the fine. And it was a cartoon, like a two-part cartoon of a woman gradually undressing, and then a man with like a thermometer next to him with the temperature rising. And it really wasn't all that risque, but they got slapped with a fine a couple days later. Likewise, if an issue was very popular, so recently I wrote about an issue of Karagöz that had a photograph or a photographic cartoon or illustration of Ataturk on its cover, which sold out, and they had to reprint. So they wrote a little column in the following issues about how everybody loves that issue and it sold out, and good for our paper boys that really worked it. So there are clues in there, and of course letters to the editor, but the cartoons aren't really usually discussed in those letters. It's usually they're asking for recommendation or help or advice, that kind of thing.
Another source that's sometimes been helpful to me to gauge whether something's landing is diplomatic reports from other countries, where they're monitoring the press for sort of open source intelligence, for lack of a better term, and they're like, "Whoa, this thing is blowing up here," and it's so sometimes you get a sense of how an external observer may give you, but once again, that's hit or miss, when you get that stuff.
Hi, I'm stuck here. I don't know if it's on anymore. Is it? Okay, cool. Hello. Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. It's really nice to kind of be in person and listen to all of you. I was just thinking about kind of seeing everything, all the different kinds of images and things. I was kind of struck by, and obviously this is the kind of common style of political cartoons and caricatures, but I guess how similar the actual artistic style is of a lot of these, as far as simple defined lines and often exaggerated features. And I was wondering if anyone on the panel had kind of thought about or considered how that particular actual artistic style of press cartoons and caricature either does help or even exaggerate or facilitate the essentialization of women and ethnic minority groups, and kind of, I guess, have you thought about how the actual artistic style plays into that essentialization that you guys are seeing in the works?
That's a very art historian question.
I'm
staying out of that one.
There you go.
I have actually noticed, looking at a lot of cartoons from America and around the world, that there's a specific style to the Ottoman cartoons and to the early Republican cartoons that I thought was specific to those, but that I'm seeing repeated across essentially the Middle East. So I don't know if this is a matter of the cartoonists, because it seems like some of the cartoonists, were in Istanbul for a little bit, and then they're in Cairo for a little bit, and I know some of my cartoonists have been to Cairo, so I wonder if they're working in close quarters to one another, or if they're taking ideas or stylistic ideas from one another. But the style is so unique. It's really, but it's hard. I think what you said about the simple lines is a good way to describe it. But it's just, if you gave me a lineup of American cartoons and Middle Eastern cartoons, I think I'd be able to identify which ones are at least definitely coming from the Ottoman Empire or Turkey. But it's something about the style. And you see it with those cartoons that I mentioned that are foreign and located in the back of the magazines, because the French cartoons have a very specific style to them, and the European cartoons and the American cartoons.
I mean, Diran, for example, he did study, or he spent some time in Istanbul, and one of the first reviews he worked for was based there. So maybe there was kind of this exchange across the region.
Yeah, and I know for a fact that the Istanbul publications are all coming out of the same quarter, so they all know each other, and presumably maybe operate in the same cafes or kıraathanes.
I think another angle that I'm not working on, but several of our colleagues out there in Iranian studies and maybe Middle East studies broadly, is the issue of sort of print culture around bookstores and how things are getting circulated that way, and where inspirations are coming from. I mean, I remember as a kid in Tehran, if you went to a certain bookstores, they would get comic books that were, your Marvel and your DC, but you also had both Iranian knockoffs of those things going on, and you had other stuff. And I didn't, I was just a kid and wasn't planning on this career at that time, but so I would have taken notes otherwise. But I do think there's maybe room to kind of look at how stylistic conventions are circulating, maybe as they're consumed, even before people are getting training or thinking professionally, to see how it shapes aesthetics, if I can put it that, for lack of a better term.
Cam, you might know this. I wonder to what extent Molla Nasruddin, the satirical newspaper, influenced Iran's satirical newspapers. Because first, it has a very long life.
Right.
And it's being circulated all over Iran. It's coming from the South Caucasus. It's Azeri.
And it's also getting, it's also, I think the other piece of this is, and maybe an art historians will, it's, if it gets appreciated, celebrated, and sort of, if you, every kind of retrospective on the Iranian press, for example, we'll pull up Molla Nasruddin, we'll pull up,
Right.
Suda Esrafil, certain things, you know,
Yeah.
so there's, and so I think, yes, there's an impact, but I think there's also a sense of it being revisited and revisited in the sort of history of, and I'm not sure at what point, you know, but there's no doubt that people are taking those cues. That whole Baku, Tabriz, Istanbul circuit, if I can put it that way. I mean, there are families that their trade is involving going around in those areas. And I think that, to go back to that expatriate merchant community and the connection with the Iranian press, I have a feeling that's a piece of things.
Yeah, that's why I would bring the South Caucasus into this Istanbul, Tabriz, Tehran. I mean, I would bring South Caucasus into the Turkey-Iran mixture, and Arab, Lebanon.
And Cairo,
Cairo,
for that matter.
yeah.
Now that we're
Cairo's
talking
huge.
about
Exactly.
it, I know that several cartoonists, Turkish cartoonists fleeing censorship, moved to Cairo and continued to practice. And I know some Iranian cartoonists moved to Istanbul to avoid censorship and continue to practice there as well. So these things are happening for many reasons.
I'm afraid I have another art historian's question similar to Samantha's. And I hope that you can provide some perspective on this. The publications in the 1920s that you used in, that Yasemin and Houri both used in their talks, impressed me by the way the design of the mastheads, the composition of the pages, were very much like the design style that prevailed in France and Germany during the 1920s. And I'm wondering whether this itself was a statement by the publications of some kind of Europeanization or connection with Europe. And I wonder if you could speak to whether the style of these publications reflected some sort of political or cultural connection that can be evaluated apart from their content, the content of the cartoons.
That's a great question, and I think the more we're prodding this, we're figuring out some answers to some of the earlier questions, because prior to the 1920s, from about 1870 to about 1908, a lot of Turkish satirical journals couldn't operate in Ottoman Istanbul because of very strict censorship. So many of them moved to Geneva and moved to Paris. And from there, we're publishing anti-Ottoman magazines for the expatriate population there. So I wonder now how much of those cues for the cover page presentation were coming from magazines like Punch that they were exposed to, and that it's mimicking the entire medium because the medium of the satirical gazette is coming from Europe. So why not also adopt the decorative masthead and give that sort of entire presentation? But I think also there's a lack of satirical gazette publishing coming out of the conservative side. So most of the satirical gazettes are being, they have varying ideologies within that, but most of them are somewhat progressive and Western leaning. So I think that you're probably onto something in that style is meant to also align them with a more Western civilization, if I can be so bold as to say that.
I would just wonder what role sort of what education played in that, or where they got educated. Whether, I mean, I know for a lot of the modern artists from Lebanon, from Egypt, from the region, a lot of them studied first in Europe, later also in the US, but initially especially Paris, Rome, London, or even went to missionary schools at home. I mean, not even having to travel. So I don't know. I mean, I know about Iran a little bit, but I don't know so much about the others. But to what extent that played really a role.
So two thoughts on that. One is a stance that a number of intellectuals took in the 20s and 30s in Iran, and you can tell me if there's a similar thing going on in Turkey, but you were a modern Iranian of the best sort if you also could translate, transform, adapt things from the West productively. That would be, in other words, if you could translate the world back to your fellow Iranians, and then that was a lane that a lot of intellectuals positioned themselves in. They would comment authoritatively on Europe, for example, but also that gave them a certain stance of talking authoritatively about things in Iran they wanted to see different. So being that kind of transitory or intermediary was, I think, a stance that a lot of folks took. And then on the sort of the processes that might have led to that, in education. In my own family, my great-grandfather sent my grandfather and his uncles sort of abroad for certain kinds of education. He was a merchant, but he wanted his kids to be professionals. And so both the seeking of education abroad, the modernization of education domestically, missionary education, all that stuff, I think, is in the mix.
So if I could give a historical response to your art historical question. So two things. One is that the editors, for example, of the newspapers, the satirical newspapers I was talking about, were educated in French schools in Iran. So there's that angle. But also the Armenian community in Iran was, in a sense, as much as the newspapers themselves had anxieties about modernity and women, the Armenian community itself was, in a sense, at the vanguard of modernization. Was very much engaged with the modernization agenda of Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah, his son. So they identified and associated themselves with Western Europe. And so it's not surprising at all that everything that came from Europe, whether it was fashion, whether it was style, whether it was education, they adapted in a way, indigenized, but were very much engaged with it. And so they were, in a sense, ideal for Reza Shah's and Mohammad Reza Shah's modernization policies. And were used and exploited in some sense by them as well. And that's something that we actually talk about in the book. And in the article, which will appear in March. Plug.
All right. On that note, we have to wrap up, but I want to thank the speakers for 4 incredibly rich papers. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your papers. Thank you for the discussion. I want to thank the audience, and both here and globally. And I would like to invite everyone. We have a reception outside with heaters, so please stay with us and have a conversation with us. Thank you.